Hello, everyone. We are going to leave some more minutes for people to join us in the meeting. This is our starting time, but let's give a couple of minutes more so that we can have more participants. Just a couple more. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor De La Osa. Nice to meet you.
Consul General, so nice that you are here with us. Thank you so much for joining this meeting today.
A pleasure to be here.
A very interesting topic, and we are going to hear about it from one expert in it.
And one where we are very committed since the Ministry of Foreign Affairs just adopted this year, as you know, the feminist foreign policy. So we are very interested in knowing what is going on around this topic.
Absolutely, very timely. Thank you so much, Consul General. Thank you. So I think we might be starting. This is going to be a recorded seminar. So you will have the opportunity to join the link with the content of the presentation in our webpage, the page of the Center for US and Mexican Law. It's important. I would like, first of all, to introduce myself. I am Alfonso López de la Osa Escribano. I'm the director of the Center for US and Mexican Law at the University of Houston Law Center. Very briefly, let me introduce the center. We are a comparative law center between the United States and Mexico. We are absolutely or pretty unique, I would say, because we are the only center specially dedicated to the legal comparative aspects of Mexico and the United States. There's many centers, sometimes many centers that deal with Mexico and the US. Sometimes we converge with them in aspects such as political sciences, economy, public health. But technically, the only one that dedicates to the comparison of institutional, legal institution and institutional aspects from the legal dimension is the Center for US and Mexican Law, and we are very proud of having this label. We organize research, we apply to grants, we organize seminars, and as well we work on bringing students from Mexico to the United States and from our university to Mexico to do externships in different areas, such as international relations, diplomacy, of course. With the Mexican Foreign Ministry, we have an institutional relationship for more than 30 years now, as well with Pemex, CNH, Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, Hydrocarbons, National Commission, and others. And we are focused on obtaining scholarships. So if you know anyone that would be willing to give funds for scholarships for Mexican students that would be willing to come to the University of Houston to do an LLM or to do a JD, please feel free to spread the word out, to talk about us, and of course to put them in contact with us. We will be more than happy of developing ways of bringing students to our university, and as well our university to interact and exchange with other universities in Mexico and the United States. So keep us in mind in that sense. We work on many topics, such as from health, public health, energy, environment. We work as well on topics such as corporate law, international business transactions, cross-border legal services, but also human rights. And on human rights, we have lately developed a scholarship and programs on human trafficking. Working on human trafficking is connected directly to something that had been lately called gender-related violence, or as well gender violence, gender-based violence, and all the declinations or breakdown of notions that might be connected or at the crossroad of human trafficking. For that, we have today an expert, a person very well versed on a notion that has been gaining weight in Mexico for the last years, and this is feminicide, feminicidio, as it is called in Mexico, and as we will see, has been regulated. Lucas Martinez Villalba is an affiliate scholar to the Center for US and Mexican Law. He has a amazing and very interesting curricula oriented to academia. He obtained his law degree from the Pontificia University Javeriana in Cali, Colombia. Afterwards, he obtained his LLM on international law by the University Iberoamericana in Mexico City. He obtained as well, master's degree in human rights by the University Iberoamericana and his LLM from the American University Washington College of Law. In this same University, Washington College of Law, he obtained as well, he's actually in the progress of obtaining his PhD on related to one of the topics he will talk about us today. He's been an adjunct faculty at the Villanova University School of Law. He's been a Dean Fellow at the American University Washington College of Law, dealing with aspects such as war crimes research office. And he has also developed and been a tutor on human rights for students at the Universidad Iberoamericana. Among many others, he's written articles and has participated in seminars, but I would like to give the panel to him. But before, I would like to mention his presentation will be around 30-35 minutes. We have two ways of doing questions. Feel free. I am very inclined to, and I prefer actually, after all these months of pandemics and Zoom meetings that we have been constantly developing with the format of the meeting, the Zoom meeting. So you all have the possibility and opportunity of making questions. You have either the chat if you want to write the question while Mr. Martinez Villalba will be speaking so that he will not interrupt, or you can of course keep the question for the moment he will have been done, he will have finished his presentation and mention it out loud in the debate question and answer that we will have. Starting then at noon, we will be closing the session at 1. And well, I think it's more or less the information you need to know. I believe all of you can unmute your mics. I know that host can normally mute and mute, but let me know if by any chance your unmute button is not working, because I can of course do this as host of this meeting. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Lucas Martinez Villalba. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward listening to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfonso. Thank you very much, especially to the Mexican Center for inviting me today to this presentation. It's actually really interesting to do it in these pandemic times. And I just want to kind of link, particularly this is pandemic time. So bear in mind that you might see a child running into the room. It's this is home networking. It's also home presenting. So he might contribute a little bit into the presentation. So if he starts talking about robots or Legos, just give him a few seconds for him to explain himself. But I was sure he'll be brief. But anyway, so well, I just wanted to begin the presentation. Let me just share my screen. All right. So I'd like to begin this kind of conversations or presentations with something that has a media or cultural relevance that explains the subject, which just gives you like an idea of what we're going to be discussing. What you're seeing right now as part of the first image of the presentation is a work, it's a picture by Sonia Madrigal. She's a photographist, a really good artist back in Mexico. And one of the works that she's been working on has precisely been detailing the situation of femicide in Mexico. And this work is particularly interesting. It's called La Muerte Sale por el Oriente, or Death Comes from the East. And what she does in this case is just she places mirrors in the places where victims of femicide have been found. And it's a very profound and, I don't know, really touching not presentation, but work that she's carried out. And I would really encourage you to follow her and see her work to see pretty much what an artist take on the whole problem of femicide back in Mexico. So just let's get into the subject right away. So you know, the situation of gender-based violence in Mexico has been kind of a topic that's been going on for many years by now, but recently, in particular for the last 10 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the numbers. To the date, and data provided by the INEGI and most recently by the Observatorio Nacional de Feminicidio back in Mexico, an estimate is calculated that on average 10 women are murdered daily in Mexico, which you've seen pretty much in the news recently, cases of Fatima and all the mobilizations that have been happening along the Mexican capital, pretty much leading to this momentum of violence that we're living. By 2019, 3,874 women were actually murdered in violent circumstances. However, here begins our problem with the issue of femicide. Out of these 3,000 and approximately women that were murdered, only 890 of them were considered as femicide. Yet the circumstances or the subjective elements that actually triggered the classification of femicide were met or might be met are not considered in this case. So that means that only 3 out of 11 women murdered are considered cases of femicide. Yet the reality might prove us something really different. Now, also I want to mention that 66.8% of this crime occurs in public settings. This is interesting because this defies or challenges the notion that the private home or the domestic setting would be the most dangerous place for a woman. There's been studies from the last decade that pretty much led into that argument. However, the recent data coming from Mexico tells us that it's quite the contrary right now, how violence in Mexico is occurring outside, and particularly in public settings. And I would like also to continue that sexual violence is in most of the cases inevitably linked to these situations of femicide. So pretty much like triggering effect or something that ignites the situation to, or escalates it to the point of reaching a case of femicide. All right, so I wanted also to highlight the most conflicted cases or states with cases of femicide by 2019 in Mexico. And sadly, we have the state of Guanajuato has reported that in 2019, 407 homicides. But let me just be clear on this definition. When I use homicide, I mean the violent murder of women. It's not homicides in the total number. Again, it's particularly referring to women, and it's out of those, 53 were considered femicides. On the second number, we have the state of Mexico with 472 homicides, but a lesser number of those considered as femicide with 26. Chihuahua, which is a case particularly interesting because it's, as we can see forward, this is pretty much the case that ignited the whole conversation for the criminalization of femicide back in Mexico. It still shows alarming levels of homicides against women with 308 in 2019 and 15 femicides. Now, I've highlighted in bright red those numbers which are not completely accurate from the murder of homicide or femicide itself, but they still highlight, they still bring high numbers of femicide. One of those states is Oaxaca with 22 femicides reported back in 2019, and then Jalisco with also 22 femicides back in 2019. So from these numbers and this kind of data provided, we need to find what's the argument to come with the idea of having a crime for the femicide in particular as a sole conduct. So I would like to draw kind of a timeline highlighting the most relevant events that happened for the criminalization of femicide in Mexico. So we have the first and most relevant issue is that between 1993, there was a documented escalation of violence, and particularly escalation of the number of women murdered. And this occurred from 1993 to 2005, where it's documented that 386 women were murdered in the city of Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua. Remember the state that we just mentioned in the slide before. Now, this situation prompted the Inter-American Court and many organizations to actually pursue bring into legal action some way to institutionalize a criminalization, because we have astounding levels of impunity, and the levels of violence have reached, according to multiple sources, systematic proportions. Now, I'd like to stop there for a second when we're gonna deal with the issue of systematic proportions, because usually we use the terms systematic and widespread solely to refer to crimes against humanity. However, there's been some work regarding human rights that tells that the element or the threshold for reaching that level of widespread and systematic can also be met or can also be applied for situations of human rights violations. And in this case, particularly, I would like to highlight two specific moments which just prompted the existence or just pushed the situation to the level that it just became widespread and systematic. One of those moments would be the state's failure to prevent these crimes. And the second one is the authorities' initial response to the murders. So we have, as I said, two moments in time in which a situation of violence was occurring pretty much uncontrolled. And on the other hand, that situation which had idiosyncratic cultural elements was also kind of being disregarded or being unprotected by the authorities. So those two elements together reach the systematic threshold or push the situation to a threshold of widespread and systematic. Now, in the case of the state failure to prevent these crimes, it's necessary that the crime must involve a relatively large number of victims, which is in this case particularly met. We just said there were 386 women murdered back in the period I mentioned. And it also needs that the repeated and unchanging and continuous nature of the violence. We had a situation that was ongoing, unstopped, and you can say that you can pinpoint it to a specific area and specific period of time. Those two elements are met. And then we actually believe that there's an actual misinterpretation, or not misinterpretation, sorry for that, kind of a failure by the state to prevent those crimes from happening. And once those crimes were presented, how was the authorities' response to them? Well, at the beginning, it was the state acted by the ascription of the victims and their families, just kind of neglecting their access to justice or simply ignoring their reports and pretty much ignoring the whole situation in total. And that just simply led to granting impunity to the perpetrators. So when that occurred, we in Mexico reached the level of widespread and systematic. That situation in particular pushed for the intervenience of the Inter-American Human Rights Court to decide on the case of Campo Algodonero. Now, Campo Algodonero is a landmark case by the Inter-American Court because it's the first time that deals with gender-based violence. And in the case of Mexico, the court condemned the state for failure to comply with obligations with regard to the context of violence against women. Now, this is an interesting decision by the Inter-American Court, if I could say, because it's the first time that the court addresses formally the issue of femicide, but it was also kind of a missed opportunity because it addressed it, however, it failed to provide a specific definition for it. And as we will see in the following slides, we'll see that the definition is kind of also a still ongoing debate. And it could have been a great opportunity for the court to provide a kind of a solid opinio juris on what we were dealing with at the moment. However, that decision condemning the state of Mexico really prompted different organizations and institutions for the push to Mexico to criminalize femicide as an individual conduct. Now, most relevant, it was CEDAW back in 26, which actually promoted that Mexico should implement in many of the recommendations a specific crime that addressed the case of femicide. So that led to the 2012 having femicide criminalized at the federal level. Now, there's kind of a situation of conflict between many of the states. As of the moment, all states in Mexico have some form of femicide criminalized in their own penal conduct, in their own penal codes. But still, we're still kind of having this situation in which where there's no harmony between the definition provided by the at the federal level and those at the individual states. Now, as I mentioned before, with the problem itself, sometimes it just leads to what are we really talking about femicide? And as of right now, and talking about 1979, which is the first time it was brought to the law. And today, there's still kind of a lot of confusion regarding what do we mean by femicide. So as I said, the first definition was provided by the author Diana Russell. And she said, she defined femicide as the murder of women perpetrated by men when motivated by hate, contempt, pleasure, or sense of property over a woman. However, this definition is by all means outdated. We have gone through many processes of, I could say the feminist movement and political situations that have led to the modification and kind of transformation of this definition. Particularly, and because we're dealing with the case of Mexico, I'd really like to highlight how the Latin American influence, and this is one of the questions I received earlier, has pretty much provided a platform for it to have a unified and also see kind of a trend that's going on in Latin America with the criminalization of femicide. So I'd write this particular definition by both our authors, Rosalinda Fregoso and Cynthia Bejarano, which defines femicide gender-based violence that implicates both the states, either directly or indirectly, and individual perpetrators. It's structural violence rooted in social, political, economic, and cultural inequalities. I want to kind of pause for a second right here with this definition, because as when Alfonso was beginning with the presentation, he mentioned something with the term femicide and the translation into Spanish, which is feminicide or feminicidio. And that in particular has been a matter of debate, still unresolved, because some states have decided to go with the natural translation, which is femicidio without the feminicide, and those without with the definition just femicide or femicidio. There's the push or the difference, I should say, between one term or the other is particular what Rosalinda Fregoso and Cynthia Bejarano are mentioning in this definition. The term feminicidio usually is applied to refer to feminicide when it also not involves the state, or impunity by the state, or acts of omission by the state that cause or lead to a situation or a case of femicide in particular, which is actually something that the femicide definition is not including. So apart from the perpetrator and in the definition of feminicide or feminicidio, we're dealing with both situations in which the perpetrator could be an individual or a private citizen, or it could be actually condemned directly to the state. And that is one of the major contributions, I should say, that the whole debate in Latin America has provided to the discussion of femicide. How are we going to overlap or kind of involve these new parties into the situation of the gender-related killing of women? However, I believe that for the matters of the present talk that I'm giving, the definition that we should kind of focus on, it's the most simple one, is the killing of women because they are women, or in many cases, just for gender reasons. Now, what do we mean? And before we say what do we mean by woman, we should go through the 3 steps of how this kind of violence is addressed institutionally, and what are we dealing with in this form of violence in particularly. So in the first case, we have the gender-based violence, which is kind of the broad term. Many treaties and agreements have used this term for decades, and it just refers to the situation of violence that is direct at an individual based on his or her biological sex or gender identity. However, the situation of violence against women has escalated to the level that it demanded a particular definition strictly for women. So commonly today, we use this definition to say or to mention the situation of violence against women. And it's pretty much the same, and any act of gender-based violence that results in is likely physical, to cause physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. But again, this evolution from gender-based violence to violence against women has also ignited a debate on whether what is this setting coming from? Where is this kind of violence originating, and what are the root causes of it? And the debate has been also pretty much enriched with by this debate into considering that there's in many situations or many cases in which the family, the state, or even the community can be settings for the situation of violence against women. So kind of decanting from gender-based violence then to violence against women, we actually get to the point of our main discussion, femicide, the killing of women because of their gender or for gender reasons. However, this also leads to another question that is part of the dissertation I'm working on is, okay, in this term, what do we mean by women? Given that we have this situation in which we're discussing a particular gender and we deal with the situation of how gender is a construct, how we understand gender, we need to define, or we need to put into the table, what are we including with this definition of women? So are we including transgender people, transsexual, intersex? Are these part of the equation when we do the definition of femicide? Remember, there's a wide range of situations, and I just can give you the most easy example, which is trans femicide. And it's been seen in many cases in Latin America where there's murders of trans women because of their decision to become women as part of their sexual orientation or their sexual, transformation. And this is also part of the debate that's been going on in the whole region on how to include or interpret the notion of gender woman into the equation of femicide. Yet, I kind of, there's a point where I get cast doubt into having a completely neutral approach. And the reason for this is statistically, and that would be pretty much the whole argument behind having all this transformation from gender-based violence to violence against women, is simply that violence against women is undoubtedly the most persistent form of gender-based violence. So it actually demands to be unique and different from any other form of violence. And yet again, these are elements that I deal with pretty much daily with the investigation I'm carrying out, but also demand that there is kind of a debate going on what the definition of femicide is per se. Now, one of the approaches taken with femicide is the argument that in order to resolve the issue of gender-based violence, the state has come up with a criminalization of femicide. Yet, in my opinion, and many scholars, is that we're tackling the problem at the very ends of it, at the worst example of gender-based violence, and that is the death of women. Before the situation of before the situation of femicide, there are particular situations of violence against women that occur, which in turn lead to the sadly result of getting into femicide. That is sexual harassment, domestic violence, situations of stalking, rape, labor harassment, sexual slavery, which all pretty much concentrically lead to a situation or end up this continuum into the last moment of femicide. So if we are going to criminalize a situation of sexual violence or gender violence in order to prevent it, we must address these instances that come before it rather than focusing particularly on the murder of women. That is also part of the problem that we're igniting here. The criminalization of femicide does provide many elements for discussion and does shed light on a situation of gender-based violence, but it's somehow taking a lot of focus that should be also given to these previous instances, which are part of the continuum of violence against women. Now, after all this pretty much introduction, I should mention that from 2012 at the federal level, the femicide was included at the Federal Penal Code. It was included in Article 325 of the Mexican Federal Penal Code. And the definition, the general definition for it, commits the crime of femicide, he who deprives a woman of life for reasons of gender. However, there is also, the definition comes with a series of subjective elements which pretty much motivate or prove the situation of femicide. According to the Article 325 in the Penal Code, these reasons of gender are: the victim shows signs of sexual violence of any kind, the victim has suffered degrading injuries or mutilations, including acts of necrophilia, either before or after her murder, there is a history of any type of domestic labor, or school violence from the perpetrator towards the victim. There has been a sentimental, affective, or trust relationship between the victim and the active subject of the crime. There are records indicating threats, harassment, or injuries from the perpetrators towards the victim, which are also related to the crime. The victim was confined regardless of the time of her murder, and the victim is exposed or exhibited at the public place. So I consider that this reasons of genders can be divided into two main branches. One of them is those acts of violence committed against the victim while or in the occurrence of the crime itself, which include those signs of sexual violence or the records indicating threats and cases of degrading mutilations. Now, the second of those groups would be acts occurred prior to the violence, to the victim's death, I'm sorry. So that also includes those threats or when there's a reason to believe that there was a sentimental or affective relationship between the victim and the active subject of the crime, and the exhibition of the victim's body in a public place. Now, I should mention, and pretty quick here, but I think that's part of one of the questions that we got on for this presentation, that this is the elements provided by the federal code. Many states, although I should say every state in Mexico has now a definition of femicide included in their penal codes. Yet having it doesn't mean that it's same or it's harmonious. And these elements vary from one to another pretty significantly. But I should use this as the model version. And I'll explain also when we get to the question I got, why this model is pretty relevant on the interpretation for the criminalization of femicide in Mexico. So that pretty much pushes into answering the question for the presentation for today's presentation. So what is really in the name? Does the crime of femicide really delivers on reducing gender-based violence? Because as I mentioned before, the argument behind having a specific conduct criminalizing femicide is to reduce or address the situation of gender-based violence and violence against women in Mexico. But again, does it really deliver on that promise? Well, I should say that although it's been already 8 years since the actual criminalization of Mexico of femicide at the federal level, there has been a situation in which legal uncertainties and weak institutionalization have led to less than 20% of violent murders of women to be treated as femicide. Like, remember I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation in the statistics that I provided that only 3 out of 11 of those murders are considered to be femicide. Yet in many cases, as many organizations or ONGs have explained, many of those cases do amount to the situation of femicide. However, at the judicial level, those interpretations are not being considered to be femicide. And that itself it's a problem regarding the whole implementation, which I believe is at this moment, the most significant issue to deal with the situation of gender-based violence. Now, according to the Attorney General's office in Mexico, the crime of femicide has increased by 137.5% since 2015. And that is astoundingly worrisome, since this occurs merely 3 years after the whole push for the criminalization and the actual crime being delivered in most of the states in Mexico. Because even when the crime was criminalized at the federal level, it took almost until 2016 for every state to implement or criminalize in their own jurisdictions femicide. And regardless of that, we're still seeing an increase in violence against women that pretty much needs to be resolved. Now, sexual violence in Mexico, according to the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality, has now reached pandemic proportions. Now, I know in these days, the term pandemic has become quite of regular language. It's part of our daily talk. So it's not easy, it's not hard to understand the problem or the situation of what entails to be considered pandemic level. The spread and the number of cases that it's reached, it's gotten to a point that it's actually almost uncontrollable, and the state must address the situation either by mitigating or providing more substantial elements to resolve it. Now, coming into the conclusions for this presentation, I should say, and I should really highlight the importance of this whole discussion of femicide that's been going on, and particularly in Latin America. The situation of gender-based violence and violence against women, and in related matters, femicide, has reached alarming levels, particularly in the region of Latin America. Now, since 2008, which was Guatemala being the first state, and Costa Rica criminalized femicide, 16 states in the region have already criminalized femicide as an independent conduct in their codes. Some states like Argentina and Venezuela have interpretations in which not a particular crime, but also part of the crime of homicide, like an aggravating circumstance. But it should be mentioned that it's a situation that is unique to Latin America. I can tell you only 2 countries outside of this region are beginning to address the situation of criminalizing femicide, being France and Spain. Yet, as a region itself, the most concentrated, or like the most preoccupied on the terms of femicide, is in fact Latin America. So the concept of femicide is significantly relevant. So I just don't want to leave the audience thinking that I am completely against of it. In fact, one of the things I believe I've learned from my dissertation is how to understand the need to have this argument, but how to kind of balance it or wrestle with the actual conflict that it provides to the legal system to have this particular criminal conduct. Yet, from a feminist perspective, it has been pivotal to have a particular crime addressing the situation of violence against women. Now, the implication of introducing feminines into the criminal system actually, as I said, interrupt or kind of provide kind of a disruption of the legal system itself, providing the interpretations in some senses that I mentioned before. How do we address the gender implication of women when we're actually trying to deal in cases of intersex? How do we deal with this situation of having multiple subjective elements? And how do we harmonize that into having one unique definition or one simply unique interpretation of femicide? And now, recognizing femicide as the most extreme form of gender violence is imperative, but it's not only the only way to address. And this is where I also want to push for kind of, I don't know, like a need for the implementation. Because as you will see from the data that we'll be providing in the next slide, the problem really is not of criminalizing the conduct itself, but to how to address to those particular situations of gender-based violence or violence against women, which are brought to the to the authorities, and what is the authority doing with them. So implementation is key, and judicializing acts of violence is also key for the actual prevention of gender-based violence and violence against women. However, and this is again pushing for the understanding of what bringing femicide into the table is, being it the most extreme form of gender-based violence, special attention should be given to the previous instances. So, like I mentioned before, the element of continuum of violence is key also to preventing the final point in the timeline of the situation of sexual violence or gender-based violence before we get to the actual femicide. When we address reports or victims coming to authorities reporting situations of sexual harassment, rape, or labor harassment, we're actually addressing the situation and preventing femicide as the most extreme form of gender-based violence. Now, it's key for us to understand that what limits the application of femicide is first impunity and access to justice. Mexico, to this date, struggled with 99% of an impunity rate in cases regarding violence against women. It also has a 99.7% of cases regarding sexual violence, which remain unreported. So the victim, which this generally speaking tells us, is that the victim is either not trusting, either simply afraid of reporting when these cases have been going on. So what the actual judicial system is dealing with is a marginal representation of the real situation of gender-based violence in Mexico. And by 2019, Mexico faced a system of pattern of impunity in situation of violence against women. So I believe that, again, having the system work before addressing the case of femicide itself, like dealing with situations of report with domestic violence, sexual violence, labor harassment, that actually serves a lot into the prevention of femicide itself, rather to have the whole criminal system working or setting into motion to address yet the final point of this continuum of violence. Now, also Mexico faces a situation of gender gap and inequality, where women actually compose 51% of the Mexican population, yet as a population or as a group, they have the least access to education and job opportunity. And finally, the cases of harassment in Mexico are also reach a level of, as I mentioned before, a pandemic, and to the point that we can say that 6 million women have reported, even though this is, again, the 0.3% of cases amounts to 6 million women reporting cases of sexual harassment. So before, let me rephrase that. So when addressing the situation of violence against women, which is pretty much the element or the argument that we're trying to deal with when we bring femicide into the table, before we have to put into motion the whole criminal system to address the final moment, which is the death of a victim, there's many instances that need to be addressed before that actually would prevent that situation from happening. And once we deal with these cases of impunity, access to justice, gender gap and inequality and harassment in particular, we would be seeing a completely different picture on the situation of gender-based violence in Mexico. And yeah, that's pretty much the struggle that we're dealing with, and the struggle I'm dealing with my dissertation at the moment. So thank you for your time again. Thanks to the University of Houston and the Mexican Center. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful presentation. I find, to start a little bit the discussion, I find interesting that one of the definitions that I think it was Rosalinda, I got the name, Rosalinda Fregoso, that includes, it's the notion of state. And it's true that every right, every human right that is violated has always a double dimension. So it's a dimension from the state that it's compelling citizens to respect a specific human right. It's called the horizontal effect, right? It's not only asking to the citizen to benefit from this protection, they're also telling to the citizen that they need to respect this right of others. So it's what we call the horizontal effect. And at the same time, we have the vertical effect, which is, so when the state is compelling citizens to respect. So horizontal and vertical. Besides that, we have the positive obligation of the state to create an atmosphere that allows the protection of citizens. So it's normally something that it's inherent to every human right, this positive obligation of states that they have to take immediate steps to protect human rights and to protect citizens. So what I find odd, at least interesting, and I would like to hear your impression about it, is that it's precisely in the positive obligation that it's asked to the states that codes in Mexico switch between feminicide and femicide. So it's the notion of state involved in the respect of the right that changed the notion. And in my view, it seems a little bit unclear. You see what I mean? I mean, it's like, it's sometimes difficult to grasp the notion. I don't know what you think about.
No, let me just begin by clarifying one issue that you mentioned there. The debate on feminicide or femicide is not occurring among the different states within Mexico. This debate is happening among different states within the region. So I mean, and I can give you particular examples. For Mexico is a country which actually has used the term feminicide or feminicidio. Also Colombia, but another particular case is femicide used in Chile. Chile provides also a really interesting situation because they use the term parricide or the crime parricide and simply transformed it, or they just pretty much switched the words into include it to femicide and created a crime by just doing that. So once again, before we get into that, the debate is not ongoing between the states in Mexico. It's pretty much in the situation in Latin America, and many states actually opting for one or the other, if it's feminicide or femicide. And I should also mention some scholars actually believe that the debate is not worth pursuing, because simply what we're dealing with here is to address the situation of violence against women. But in the case of at the state level, yes, some states have actually provided different interpretations, but they have not really kind of fallen so far from the general definition. Now, I will take this opportunity to answer one of the questions that I was given before, and is why Chihuahua in particular is not having or lacks a definition or a crime that is pretty much independent in the code, because it just occurs as an aggravated circumstance, and why is it kind of so different? But I don't know. So right off the bat, I can tell you that the problem with Chihuahua is that it's the state that pretty much ignited all. It's the case that got into the level of being addressed at the Inter-American Court, and still we have high numbers of femicide, as it can also be seen in the statistics there. But for some reason, the state has actually decided to kind of stay with this definition that it's an aggravated circumstance to homicide. Now, I want to highlight that the Observatorio Nacional de Feminicidio has worked pretty diligently and has provided a very formidable interpretation. And in fact, it was the institution which kind of reached out to the states in order to nurture them or kind of coach them into having a very profound or a very robust definition of femicide. This is very much aligned with the definition used by the federal code. And in the report, I would recommend if there's a need to understand pretty much not the reasons behind, because we will never know why Chihuahua decided to go this way, but pretty much the elements behind the definition Chihuahua is providing is a report provided by this Observatorio Nacional de Feminicidio, in which they actually go state by state, explaining that many of these cases many of these descriptions are kind of similar one to another. But I should say, and I must be really emphatic, that it doesn't fall that far from the general definition. What really varies, and that's pretty much what makes it interesting, it's in the subjective elements. Some states discard some states add another, but as a general model, I would say the federal code is pretty much in that understanding. And it's important also to mention that this interpretation of the state being responsible and using, again, the term feminicidio is actually applicable to Mexico, and it's kind of an unquestioned situation.
Okay, well, thank you so much. While any other question pops up, please, yes. Oba, I'm going to, and I think you can mute yourself. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lucas, for your insightful presentation. What term did the Inter-American Court refer to when they condemned Mexico?
Well, the condemnation was regarding the disappearance of 3 women in the state of Juarez, but the most relevant case in the situation in the case of Campo Algodonero was that it actually condemned the state for the failure to comply and to provide protection to the victims of femicide. So what I mean, and this is also a discussion that I have, is that for the first time, the court used the term femicide or feminicide in this case, but it never kind of defined it into a strictly legal term, and it wasn't a missed opportunity. It defined gender-based violence. It worked around the situation of violence against women, and it condemned the state for the situation of human rights violation in its duty to prevent. But as providing a definition, it just kind of missed the opportunity.
And how about what ground? What ground did the court refer to? Human rights declaration provision, or a specific provision deriving from any resolution, or maybe the case law of the court?
I'm sorry, I'm kind of not following.
Yes, I'm just asking the ground on which the court based the condemnation of the federal state of Mexico.
Well, because pretty much because the situation of the disappearance and murder of women was kind of ongoing for the last years, and many of those investigations and cases were left unopened, the court decided that the state had not met their obligation to fully investigate, and in fact was also aware of the situation of gender-based violence, but didn't pretty much nothing to act upon it. So in that situation, it condemned the state.
No, it's very, very interesting. And also something that I think points out your research, Lucas, is you were starting with the number about that femicide was a crime that occurred for 66.8% outside of a domestic environment, like a home. And there's pretty much a big discussion now on what it's gender-based crime. At least in Spain, it has been a discussion about violencia de género, violencia doméstica, if it should be all of it under the same umbrella of violence against women. So it's and the consideration of gender-based when we are dealing indeed with a 66% outside of home, I think it's very relevant to know that we not only need to address this in the inside a home, but also outside. So I think this is very relevant numbers about how this occurs in public setting. It's more of a commentary about it. Also the continuum, no, it's not to be a recidivist, I would say, because it's something that you need to be condemned beforehand to be really a recidivist, but at least that we can prove the continuum of a specific action in order to condemn it afterward. But I guess that the difficulty there is the evidence. I mean, in a trial, I envision that unless the woman takes very strict each time the fact of claiming in front of the police and making the denunciation, how can harassment be demonstrating in a continuum before suing someone because of before being able to confront the crime of femicide, if I understand it well? You know, how can this evidence be proved? Are the laws envisioning a specific way of notification of things that are happening? You understand my point?
Yes, and I think that there's two questions kind of developing from that. So first, regarding the shift from the public, from the private to the private setting. Now, that is, I believe it's key to the interpretation of gender-based violence in the present day, because there's the debate on what domestic violence entails and the repercussions is being debunked by this reality of having violence that has shifted to the public space. And that is something, there's many articles that pretty much regarding the situation where the private goes public, in which the state now has to deal with situations that were considered pretty much as part of domestic violence and addressed in a particular manner, but now are being translated or transported into the public setting. That is, in fact, a whole issue of interpretation itself. But it is important to make the distinction, and pretty much this debate on gender-based violence or violence against women is actually promoting this debate to happen, in which it proves like, hey, the whole situation of violence against women is not strictly limited to the domestic setting. It's not, and by this we mean this not a partner situation. Women are subject to violence in many other instances that it not only entails domestic relationship, it also entails their regular life outside their homes. So this actually provides a new ground of analysis, if I should say, and it actually involves or triggers the state to adopt measures that are now to protect not only as a situation of domestic violence, but also of violence against women in particular. Now, regarding this, the second element that you mentioned, could you remind me of the second part? I kind of lost it for a second.
Yes, no, so I mean, yeah, me as well. So we were talking about the, so what was it? First about the notion, I don't recall now what it was mentioned.
Let me just kind of refresh.
It was more related to the fact that we were
you mentioned the continuum element. Okay.
Public to private, and the continuum and the recidivist, the fact of the evidence, indeed.
So there is, in fact, and I should say Mexico is kind of in the vanguard of that. They have it's kind of a program or project called Alerta de Género, in which when a situation of gender-based violence or violence against women occurs, the institution is notifies and kind of launches this alert or alarm of gender, which actually prompts that every institution in Mexico is aware of a situation of gender-based violence. So it includes any reports on sexual harassment, rape, sexual violence, and it actually triggers that. And I should say that even though it might be hard to prove in kind of in the general term to have these alertas or these reports coming in, and one of the things that I run upon, or kind of deal a lot with my investigation is the power of non-governmental organizations and how they are key to actually keep records and report this. These numbers, these figures are pretty much well kept by this organization. I can remember many of them. There's also a study by, I think it's Femicide, which is Claves para Entender la Violencia de Género en México, and they provide data that pretty much follows each and every step. Now, aside from this non-governmental organizations that are taking care of that, it's actually the state responsibility to keep a record on that. And in many cases, what by this organization just do is kind of report, sadly, when the femicide has occurred, hey, there was a report that this woman came to the public minister and asked for protection by the police or by the public minister because she was being harassed, she was being beaten by her husband, she was being stalked, whatever the situation. And these organizations have been, again, kind of fundamental in providing that situation. Sadly, what's going on is that these reports are, again, coming up at the end of the spectrum, or at the end of the equation when the femicide has already occurred. My argument in this case is that if we address those reports, those denuncias at the moment they occur, and we take them seriously, this is a significant way to reduce the situation of gender-based violence and prevent the actual existence occurrence of femicide. It's pretty basic, but it's actually something that's been proven to work marvelous in countries that have dealt with it. Now, I'm gonna move a little bit and mention the case of Colombia. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court actually decided that the state should be held complicit if it was proven that a report had been made by a woman who was harassed, stalked, whatever the case, and the state didn't act upon it in a particular period of time, say 3 months. If nothing had happened, then the state would be held responsible for that situation in particular. Now, if it amounts to femicide, it would be a much bigger problem, but it's actually kind of trying to address the situation in which the woman is actually, or a victim is actually providing elements to say, this is happening and we all know the outcome. This is when we need to act like now. Yeah, that's pretty much that.
No, very fascinating. Is there any other question on the audience? Yes, Consul Kerber, please.
Sorry, just a comment. I think that in Mexico, we have moved forward, but we still need to recognize our weaknesses in order to really move more forward. Something that I think also is that in order to combat feminism, it's necessary that more women making law, more women participating in the elaboration of norms, more women applying the norms, and also more women making the investigations. Because otherwise we won't be able to assure access of justice to all these women. In the other side, as I was telling when we began this talk, is that Mexico is the only country in this region that has adopted a feminist foreign policy, but we don't want to stay just in that declaration, but in specific actions. And that is why my country is the only country that has created a tool in the consular field that it's called the Window for the Integral Attention for Women, where we want to assure women access for justice, because the reality that you see in Mexico is the same that they face here in the United States, even though they have another type of environment. So there's still many impossibility for them to have access to justice, especially if they are undocumented, especially if they don't know the language, especially if they don't know the legal structure or the administrative structure. So for that is that why Mexico has created this Window for the Integral Attention of Women that has been replicated in the 50 consulates that Mexico has in the United States. So we are working for a gender review, and we have seen that it's not only necessary to, as Professor Martinez was saying, to really see the cases once there has been a woman killed by any kind of reason. But we are trying to target the people so that they can understand the causes. And we are working with this violent matter, where we try to tell the woman, be alert, see the different stages of violence, because maybe you began with jealousy, jokes, playing, or all this, and you will end maybe killed by your partner. So I think that as Professor Lucas Lucas Martinez was saying, the work of NGO has been a very important tool also here in the United States, but also in Mexico. We need to put them together in order that they can have this dialogue beyond borders. The problematic is not a problem that is faced only by a country, it's a regional country, it's a cultural situation. It needs to go beyond the political agenda. It's something related with human rights, with basic human rights. So that's why we are working here at the consulate to make this be faced and to face it with public policies in the international field. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you, Consul, for that. And I just want to link it, your words with something that is also really important, and pretty much what you mentioned you're doing at the consulate. It's one of the things that is key is actually to provide victims of sexual violence or domestic violence or any form of gender-based violence with the assurance that reporting and coming forward telling their story is safe for them. And I believe that is also key. Once we kind of, I don't know how to say it, kind of not promote it, but kind of provide tools for that to happen, we would have a different perspective on what the whole situation of gender-based violence. So yes, having institution on the side, actually encouraging women to come forward, actually granting them a situation where they will feel protected and feel pretty much not re-victimized, which is also an amazing problem that we deal with every day, but also where they will feel safe is key also.
Thank you very much, Lucas, and yes, indeed, Consul Kerber, for your very pertinent comments. I would say, indeed, reporting, and this connects with our human trafficking program and scholarship we are doing, the say something, see something, say something. This reporting would be in the say something, that it's clue for victims to feel protected. And what can I say from the university? Education and training to women, what they should never accept by no means, and education also to society, what no one should ever do, not even crossing their mind. So, well, with these words, I would like to close the meeting for today. We're a little bit away the time, but it's really worth it. It was a very interesting conversation. As I said at the beginning, it is recorded. It will be recorded and posted in our webpage. So if you feel like you would like to see it again or to share it with someone, please feel free to do it. Thank you so much, Lucas Martinez Villalba, for your presentation. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you.